The world had been holding its breath for months. Tensions between the US and China were escalating, with tariffs being slapped left and right. But no one could have anticipated the game-changer that Donald Trump was about to unleash. It came in the dead of night, like a storm brewing on the horizon. 145% tariffs on Chinese imports were imposed by executive order. The White House press release was terse, a necessary measure to protect American industries and jobs from unfair Chinese practices. But the global markets, already shaky from trade wars and geopolitical uncertainty, immediately started to tremble. The backlash was swift. China, unable to bear the pressure of such drastic tariffs, decided to retaliate. In a bold, decisive move, they devalued the yuan to an unprecedented level. It was a sharp blow to the global economy, and it sent shockwaves across financial markets. By morning, the world was in a state of chaos. The U.S. stock market, a symbol of strength and confidence, was in free fall. Traders watched in disbelief as the Dow Jones plummeted by 2,000 points in just a matter of hours. The ripple effect was immediate. Other markets around the world followed suit, with Asia, Europe, and even emerging markets taking a direct hit. In Washington, the White House was scrambling to assess the damage. Trump's trade advisors were caught off guard by the sheer magnitude of China's response. The president himself remained confident, even smug, insisting that the tariffs would bring China to its knees. But for many in the U.S., this was no longer just a trade dispute, it was an existential crisis. As the hours passed, the magnitude of the financial fallout became undeniable. Wall Street, once a bastion of capitalist power, was now a battlefield. Traders frantically punched numbers into their screens, but no one could stop the bleeding. The Nasdaq, once the darling of tech investors, lost nearly 10% of its value in a single day. The S&P 500, a measure of the broad market, followed suit. It was like a slow-motion disaster unfolding before the eyes of millions. American businesses, particularly in manufacturing and technology, were hit hardest. The tariffs had escalated the cost of production overnight. Companies that depended on Chinese imports for raw materials and parts were already facing higher prices. But now, with the yuan devalued, their products became even more expensive, and the cost of doing business soared. Several large corporations, such as Apple and Ford, issued statements warning of delayed production timelines and potential layoffs. In the heart of the financial chaos, the U.S. government moved quickly to stabilize the economy. The Federal Reserve, under increasing pressure, slashed interest rates to try and soften the blow. But nothing seemed to help. The damage was too deep. For the American public, the situation was turning into a nightmare. Retirement accounts were evaporating, investments were wiped out, and the once promising American economy was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Long lines of anxious people gathered outside banks, worried about their savings, while others turned to social media to vent their frustrations. Meanwhile, Trump's rhetoric only seemed to escalate. "This is just the beginning," he declared in a public speech. "The Chinese have been taking advantage of America for far too long. We are going to win this war, and we are going to come out stronger." But were they? The world wasn't so sure anymore. The effects of Trump's tariffs were becoming more widespread by the minute. While the markets continued their plunge, the ramifications reached every corner of the globe. China, in its counterattack, wasn't just devaluing the yuan, they were also cutting back on exports to the U.S. Especially rare earth minerals and electronics components, critical for American tech industries. The repercussions were felt most acutely in Silicon Valley, where panic started to set in. Leading tech companies were forced to scramble for alternative suppliers, but the damage was already done. Without critical components from China, production lines were halted, and product launches were delayed indefinitely. Apple's stock plummeted even further, and smaller startups, reliant on global supply chains, were left in financial ruins. In Washington, political infighting was intensifying. Key members of Trump's own party began to express growing concern. Senator Mitch McConnell, typically a staunch ally of the president, privately warned him that the tariffs were pushing the economy to the brink. The economy was beginning to show signs of recession, and many in the GOP feared that the fallout would cost them the 2020 elections. Overseas, things were no better. European markets, already facing their own set of challenges, were now in freefall as well. The UK and the Eurozone were hit hard, with their economies closely tied to both the US and China. Germany, Europe's largest economy, was now staring down the barrel of a major slowdown. Trade routes were strained, and goods were stuck in limbo as customs officials across the globe struggled to process the flood of changes. As the day wore on, Trump remained defiant, doubling down on his rhetoric. He claimed that the market crash was just temporary pain for long-term gain and that the U.S. would emerge victorious in this trade war. But to the average American, it didn't feel like victory was anywhere on the horizon. The government's bailout plans were still in the works, but they were slow to arrive. Banks tightened lending standards, making it harder for individuals and businesses to access credit. People started losing their jobs in droves, and unemployment numbers were climbing faster than anyone anticipated. It was an economic meltdown, and the worst was yet to come. In the midst of the chaos, Wall Street analysts were left to ponder the ultimate question: could the U.S. survive the storm Trump had unleashed? The damage was no longer just financial, it was psychological. In the heart of America's cities, an overwhelming sense of fear began to take hold. The streets, once bustling with the optimism of a strong economy, now felt quieter, more strained. People were holding on to what little they had left, pulling back from unnecessary purchases, and refusing to invest in anything uncertain. In small towns across the U.S., the effects of the tariff war were even more pronounced. Local businesses that depended on imports from China were struggling to stay afloat. Farmers who relied on global trade for their exports now saw their profits tanking. The once booming agricultural sector began to show signs of a downturn as China retaliated by imposing tariffs of its own on U.S. goods. Soybeans and corn, staples of American exports, were now stuck in storage, unable to be sold to international buyers. The result was catastrophic for many farmers, and bankruptcies were spreading like wildfire. At the same time, the country was watching a political spectacle unfold. Trump's trade war, now in full swing, had divided the nation even further. Democrats were vocal in their criticism, accusing the president of acting recklessly and risking the livelihoods of millions for a trade policy that had no clear endgame. They demanded an emergency response and more serious negotiations with China to de-escalate the situation. But the president, emboldened by his base, seemed to dismiss their concerns. His message remained the same: the tariffs were meant to punish China for its unfair practices, and the U.S. would only benefit in the long run. However, as the economy continued to spiral, many of his former supporters began to question his leadership. In the halls of Congress, Republicans who had once stood by Trump were now beginning to speak out against him, though quietly and cautiously. They feared the mounting political pressure would soon reach critical mass. The GOP, already divided, was now facing the very real possibility that they would lose control of the Senate in the upcoming elections. It was in this political climate that Trump's approval ratings began to tank. Public opinion polls, once a symbol of his dominance, now reflected a growing disillusionment with his policies. The American people were tired. They were tired of the endless trade wars, the failed promises, and the constant chaos. And then came the breaking point. It came suddenly, as if the world had reached a tipping point and everything began to break down at once. The U.S. economy, already teetering on the edge, finally faltered. The stock market, which had already been hemorrhaging for weeks, collapsed in a final, devastating blow. The Dow Jones dropped another 1,500 points in a matter of hours, bringing it to its lowest point in decades. The S&P 500, once a symbol of stability, had plunged by nearly 30% from its peak. In a matter of days, the national debt skyrocketed as the government, desperate to stem the damage, began a massive emergency bailout plan, $3 trillion worth of taxpayer money to keep businesses afloat. But it wasn't enough. The economic collapse was too deep, and the bailout didn't reach the heart of Main Street. Small businesses, the lifeblood of the American economy, were failing at an alarming rate. In the streets, protests began to erupt. Citizens were angry at the government, angry at Wall Street, and most of all, angry at Trump. The president's approval ratings hit rock bottom as people realized the full extent of the damage his trade war had caused. The slogan, "Make America Great Again," had lost its shine. Now, it was more a symbol of broken promises and unfulfilled hope than a call to action. In Washington, the political fallout was explosive. A groundswell of bipartisan support emerged for impeachment hearings. The Democratic-controlled House, energized by growing public sentiment, moved swiftly to open an investigation into Trump's handling of the trade war and its disastrous consequences. Even some Republicans, who had once remained loyal to the president, began to speak out against him in the face of mounting public pressure. Yet, Trump remained defiant. In a primetime speech, he doubled down once more, claiming that the economic pain was temporary, that China would eventually give in, and that America would come out stronger. But as he spoke, the anger and disillusionment that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. A nation in crisis, facing its worst economic collapse in a generation, wasn't willing to hear the same tired rhetoric anymore. The streets were filled with people demanding answers, their voices growing louder each day. It wasn't just about tariffs anymore. It was about a country that felt betrayed by its leadership, about a future that seemed uncertain at best. And as the public backlash against Trump intensified, the world watched to see how this American drama would unfold. Would he survive the storm he'd created, or would the chaos he'd unleashed finally be his undoing? The situation in America had reached a breaking point. The economic turmoil, which had once seemed like a distant threat, was now a full-blown crisis. In the heart of Washington, the halls of Congress had become a battleground. The impeachment proceedings were moving forward with startling speed, fueled by mounting public pressure. It wasn't just the Democrats anymore. Republican senators who had once been Trump's staunchest allies were now privately considering the unthinkable, abandoning him. The president, surrounded by a dwindling circle of loyal advisers, was becoming more isolated. His public appearances were increasingly erratic, his rhetoric growing more desperate. In one infamous speech, Trump lashed out at the media, accusing them of attacking America and sabotaging the economy. The crowd, once filled with fervor and loyalty, now seemed lukewarm, as the economic crisis had drained the energy from even his most ardent supporters. In the midst of this turmoil, there was an even greater realization: Trump's trade war with China had far-reaching consequences that extended beyond the financial markets. Global supply chains had been shattered, and the ripple effects of the tariffs were now being felt in every corner of the world. The U.S. was no longer seen as the economic powerhouse it once was. In fact, many countries were starting to look elsewhere for leadership. The Chinese government, while reeling from the effects of the trade war, had come out of the crisis far stronger than many had anticipated. Their ability to weather the storm, aided by their control over key global resources and their ability to devalue the yuan, had given them an upper hand in negotiations. They began to position themselves as a new global leader, seizing the opportunity to increase their influence in international markets while the U.S. struggled to keep pace. Back in the U.S., the crisis was far from over. The once booming American job market had evaporated, leaving millions unemployed. Small businesses, particularly in the retail and manufacturing sectors, had shuttered for good. The government's bailout programs, though massive, couldn't prevent the widespread job losses, and it became clear that the American dream was slipping further and further out of reach for an entire generation. In the midst of it all, the Republican Party found itself at a crossroads. The upcoming election was just around the corner, and many of Trump's former supporters were now looking for a new direction. Could the GOP survive the fallout of his presidency, or would the party, along with Trump's legacy, be forever tarnished by the devastating consequences of the trade war? With impeachment proceedings gaining momentum and the economy in shambles, it seemed that the days of Trump's political dominance were numbered. But even as his grip on power weakened, his refusal to back down kept the nation on edge. The final showdown, between a president unwilling to admit defeat and a country demanding accountability, was fast approaching. The final days of Trump's presidency were nothing short of chaotic. As the impeachment hearings gained steam and public outcry reached a fever pitch, the president found himself cornered. His once rock-solid base of support was crumbling under the weight of a battered economy, mass unemployment, and mounting disillusionment. The trade war he had championed had caused irreversible damage, and the country was now reeling from the consequences of his policies. In an attempt to salvage his legacy, Trump gave one final speech. It was filled with defiance, but it was clear to anyone watching that the man who had once dominated the political stage was now struggling to maintain control. "They want to tear down everything we've worked for," he declared, "but we've already made America great. No one can take that away from us." But it was too late. His words, once filled with power and conviction, now fell flat. The country had moved on. The impeachment proceedings, despite his best efforts to block them, continued to gain momentum. In the end, it wasn't just his trade policies or his divisive rhetoric that brought him down, it was his refusal to change, to listen, to adapt. As the impeachment vote approached, Republicans who had once stood by him began to distance themselves. With mounting pressure from their constituents and a growing sense of inevitability, they turned on the president, signaling the final break between Trump and the party that had once been his staunchest ally. When the impeachment vote was cast, it was a stunning rebuke. Trump was impeached by the House of Representatives, and the Senate, though still controlled by Republicans, was no longer willing to defend him. His fate seemed sealed. In a final, humiliating blow, Trump's political career came to an end, and with it, the chaos he had unleashed on the American people. But the damage was far from over. As the dust settled, the U.S. was left to pick up the pieces. The economy, still reeling from the effects of the trade war, would take years to recover. Businesses that had once thrived now struggled to stay afloat, and the American people, scarred by the turmoil, would face a long road ahead. The world had changed, and so had America's place in it. The chaos that Trump's tariffs had sparked would be remembered as a turning point in history, a moment when the global economic order shifted, and the U.S. lost its footing as the dominant economic superpower. As for Trump, his legacy was forever tied to the disastrous trade war and its aftermath. The man who had once promised to make America great again had left a nation fractured, divided, and struggling to find its way. It was a bitter end to a tumultuous chapter in American history, one that no one would soon forget. The final question remained: could America rebuild from the ashes, or had the damage been too great to repair?